Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and overlooked corners of history. How people actually cooked food in medieval times without the modern kitchens we take for granted today. No stoves, no ovens like ours. No running water, no refrigerators. Just raw fire, stone, clay, iron, and ingenuity. If that sounds wild, stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll have a whole new respect for the sheer resilience and creativity of our ancestors. And before we get started, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into history, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps keep these stories alive. So let's set the stage. Imagine yourself walking into a medieval village. The smell hits first. Wood smoke drifting in the air, the faint tang of cabbage and onions boiling, maybe even the sharp bite of salted fish being prepared for dinner. Forget the shiny appliances of a modern kitchen. What you'd see instead is an open hearth right in the middle of a single-room cottage. A fire smoldering day and night, the center of both cooking and survival. Meals weren't whipped up quickly. They were slow, smoky, and always tethered to that flame. Cooking in medieval times started with fuel. Firewood was the lifeblood of every hearth, and gathering it was a daily burden. Villagers sent children to pick up sticks, men to chop larger logs, and women to ration what was burned, because wood wasn't always plentiful. In towns where forests had been cleared, peat or dried animal dung sometimes took its place. Imagine cooking your family's only hot meal of the day over smoldering peat. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept bellies full. The hearth itself wasn't just a place for warmth, it was a dangerous, unruly kitchen. Flames leapt and sparks flew. There were no safety measures. A kettle of stew hung from an iron hook over the fire, sometimes swinging wildly as logs shifted. Heavy cauldrons, blackened with soot, bubbled endlessly. And it wasn't unusual for women to walk away with burns, their arms scarred from boiling broth spilling across rough dirt floors. Cooking was survival, but it was also a daily gamble with fire. So what did they eat? The backbone of medieval cooking was pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat a family could get. It was humble, filling, and endlessly adaptable. If you had cabbage, it went in. A few leeks, toss them in too. Some families added bits of salted pork or bacon fat when fortune smiled. For the poor, it was often thin, watery, and stretched as far as it could go. For wealthier households, pottage could be thick, rich, and fragrant with herbs. Same name, completely different meals depending on who you were. Bread was another essential, but don't think of soft, fluffy loaves from a bakery. For peasants, bread was dark, coarse, often made with rye or barley, sometimes stretched with ground beans or even weeds in times of famine. It was dense and heavy, meant to fill the stomach more than delight the tongue. And because ovens were rare in peasant cottages, villagers relied on communal bakehouses. Each household mixed its dough at home, then carried it to the local oven, where a baker tended the fire and baked for the whole community. The smell of baking bread would waft across villages, signaling both sustenance and social life. But bread wasn't always eaten the way we think. One clever medieval trick was the trencher, a thick slice of stale bread used as a plate. Meat and gravy were piled on top, soaking into the bread. By the end of the meal, The trencher was either eaten by the diner, given to the poor, or even tossed to dogs. No dishwasher needed. Bread literally absorbed the mess. Meat was a luxury, though its role depended heavily on your social class. Nobles dined on roasted swans, venison, and boar, spiced with cinnamon, pepper, and saffron to show off their wealth. Peasants, meanwhile, might only see meat on special feast days. Chickens were too valuable for their eggs, cows for milk, so slaughtering an animal was a major decision. That's why salted pork and preserved fish became the backbone of protein for ordinary people. You could hang pork from the rafters or salt herring in barrels to last through the winter. Speaking of fish, the medieval diet leaned heavily on it, not just because of scarcity of meat, but because of religion. The church mandated countless fast days where meat was forbidden. That left fish as the go-to alternative. Rivers and ponds were stocked, and monasteries even built elaborate fish ponds to ensure supply. Herring and cod salted by the barrel traveled across Europe, creating what some historians call the oil industry of the medieval world. Huge, lucrative, and absolutely essential. Now, let's talk tools. Forget blenders, mixers, or even proper stoves. Medieval kitchens relied on knives, wooden spoons, mortar and pestles, and massive iron cauldrons. Food was chopped on wooden boards, ground by hand, and stirred endlessly. Almond milk, a staple in wealthy kitchens, was made by pounding almonds into paste, mixing them with water, and straining through cloth. Labor-intensive, but it created a creamy base for sauces and fast-day meals. And while nobles had professional male cooks running sprawling kitchens, the average peasant's kitchen was ruled by women. From dawn to dusk, wives and daughters fed fires, carried water, stirred stews, churned butter, and baked bread. They healed with herbs, fed children, and endured the burns and smoke that came with it all. A peasant woman's kitchen was pharmacy, pantry, and hospital rolled into one. And though few of their names survive, their labor kept medieval society alive just as much as knights or kings. But don't think medieval cooking was always grim or monotonous. Festivals transformed kitchens into sites of joy. At harvest time, pigs were slaughtered, cider was brewed, and whole villages came together to roast, bake, and feast. Honey drizzled over fritters, meat pies stuffed with herbs, and mugs of ale passed from hand to hand. These moments punctuated hard lives with sweetness, reminding everyone that food could be celebration, not just survival. Street food thrived, too, in bustling towns like London or Paris. Vendors sold hot pies, pancakes fried in fat, bowls of pea soup, or skewers of roasted meat. It was messy, noisy, and sometimes risky. Spoiled meat wasn't uncommon, but it kept laborers fed and gave towns their energy. In many ways, medieval street vendors were the ancestors of modern fast food, feeding people quickly and cheaply amid the chaos of urban life. And then there were the feasts. Noble banquets weren't just dinners, they were theater. Roasted peacocks with feathers reattached, pies that burst open with live birds, sugar castles taller than a man. Dishes were dyed bright red, green, and gold, with herbs and spices to dazzle guests. The food wasn't only about taste, it was status, politics, even propaganda. To sit near the high table meant power. To be served gilded meat meant favor. In those halls, dining was diplomacy. Yet while nobles staged edible theater, peasants quietly soaked their bread in broth at home. That contrast between extravagance and subsistence defines medieval cooking more than any recipe. One pot of cabbage kept a family alive. One gilded pie cemented a lord's reputation. We can't forget monasteries either. Their kitchens fed not only monks but also the poor at their gates. Meals there were humble. Bread, beans, fish, herbs, and ale. Silence often ruled, with monks eating while scripture was read aloud. And yet, even in monasteries, food could blur with indulgence. Records show abbots enjoying meat or wine far beyond what rules allowed. A reminder that even in cloisters, appetite was hard to suppress. Cooking on the road was another story. Altogether, pilgrims carried hard cheese, dried fish, and dense bread. Soldiers boiled oats in small iron pots. Sometimes, hunger forced men to chew softened leather or gnaw stale biscuit. Fires by the roadside dotted medieval Europe, each one a fragile lifeline against hunger and cold. And at sea, it was even harsher. Salted beef, tough as leather, ship's biscuits hard as wood, and spoiled meat endured with grim determination. Food at sea wasn't pleasure, it was sheer endurance. But through it all, medieval people carried an extraordinary resilience. They cooked with what they had. They stretched meals with pickled vegetables, flavored broths with herbs, preserved fish and meat for lean months, and built traditions around both scarcity and abundance. Every meal was labor, but it was also culture, memory, and meaning. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. Cooking in medieval times wasn't just about feeding bodies, it was about binding communities, reinforcing faith, displaying power, and teaching survival. Every pot of pottage, every slice of bread, every barrel of herring tells us not only what they ate, but who they were. Now let's walk closer, right into the smoky heart of those homes. Imagine stepping through the doorway of a peasant's cottage at dusk. The air is thick, almost choking, because most houses didn't even have proper chimneys. Smoke from the open hearth rose into the rafters, staining the thatch black, and then leaked out slowly through small holes in the roof. Your eyes would sting, your throat scratch, and yet to people of the time, this was normal. They lived in that haze day after day, and cooking couldn't happen without it. The hearth was both kitchen and heater. Families huddled around it, children sleeping on straw mattresses nearby, animals sometimes penned indoors for warmth. The same fire that cooked their meal also kept them alive through long winters. Housewives were masters of managing embers. They raked ashes carefully over coals at night, so the fire would smolder until morning, because relighting from scratch was a struggle. Sparks could take forever to catch, especially with damp wood. Keeping a fire alive was as important as keeping food in the pot. Cooking itself was an art of balance. Too much flame and your stew burned. Too little and the barley never softened. Women learned to read heat by instinct. The color of embers, the sound of bubbling broth, the way smoke curled. There were no thermometers, no dials to adjust. Everything depended on watching, listening, and endless patience. Meals stretched for hours, flavors deepening in cauldrons as children darted in and out of the smoky room. One of the great dangers of medieval kitchens was fire itself. Entire villages sometimes burned because a spark leapt from a hearth onto straw. Housewives wore wool dresses that could smolder slowly, giving them time to beat out flames, but burns were still common. Records from medieval towns mention ordinances requiring citizens to cover fires at night, precisely because one careless moment could reduce dozens of cottages to ash. But cooking was about more than fire. It was also about preservation. Without refrigeration, people had to be ingenious. Salt was the great ally. Salted pork, salted herring, salted cod barrels of it lined storerooms, keeping meat edible through winter. Vinegar and brine turned vegetables into pickles, cabbage into sauerkraut, garlic into sharp little bursts of flavor that cut through heavy stews. Smokehouses preserved meat by drying it over smoldering fires, leaving that deep, savory taste still loved today. Herbs played a role too, not just for flavor, but for health. Mint, sage, parsley, rosemary, families grew them in small plots or gathered them wild. A pinch of thyme might disguise the sourness of old meat. A sprig of sage was believed to ease coughs or stomach pains. Cooking blurred constantly with medicine. A pot of pottage wasn't just dinner. It was also a remedy. Now picture the tools scattered around that hearth. Heavy iron cauldrons hanging from chains. Clay pots perched near the fire, slow baking roots. Wooden ladles, iron knives, coarse pottery bowls. The mortar and pestle was as essential as the frying pan is to us today. Grains, spices, even nuts were pounded by hand. A loaf of bread wasn't possible without hours of grinding grain, either by hand quern or by taking it to the village mill. The clatter of millstones turning with the push of a water wheel was as much a sound of medieval life as church bells. And what about meals themselves? Breakfast, as we think of it, barely existed. Most people ate two main meals, one around midday, another in the evening. The first meal might be pottage, cheese, and ale. The second was often similar, perhaps with bread, broth, or small bits of fish or meat, if fortune allowed. Snacks were simple: a hunk of bread, an apple or dried peas roasted over embers. No sugar rush, no coffee break, just slow, steady calories to keep laborers going. Cooking wasn't done alone. It was communal, especially in villages. Women shared ovens, traded recipes, and leaned on each other in times of scarcity. When grain was short, families pooled what they had. When an animal was slaughtered, neighbors gathered to help and received shares in return. Medieval cooking was social glue. Sharing a pot of stew wasn't just kindness, it was survival. For wealthier families, kitchens grew more complex. Prosperous merchants built stone fireplaces with chimneys, reducing smoke. They had the luxury of private bread ovens, so they didn't depend on communal bakehouses. Their wives might own copper pots, finer utensils, and even hire servants to help with the workload. But even in these homes, meals were slow, laborious, and tied to the rhythm of fire. One fascinating detail is how recipes traveled without modern media. A visiting relative, a traveling merchant, or a passing pilgrim might bring a new idea for a pie filling or a stew. Cooks passed it along orally, daughter to mother, apprentice to master. Only the very wealthy saw written cookbooks, and even then, those were less instructions than reminders. Take hens, boil them, add almonds, saffron, and serve. You had to know the rest. Cooking knowledge lived in memory, in hands, not on paper. It's worth pausing to think about how much effort went into a single meal. To make bread, someone had to grow grain, harvest it, thresh it, grind it, mix it, knead it, carry it to the oven, and finally bake it. To make stew, someone had to fetch water from a well, gather herbs, chop vegetables, tend the fire, stir constantly, and serve it in bowls that were handmade. Nothing was instant. Nothing was easy. But the result was deeply satisfying because every bite was earned. Children grew up in that rhythm. From a young age, they carried water, collected firewood, stirred pots, and learned the names of herbs. They knew how to gut fish, pluck chickens, and milk goats long before modern kids might learn multiplication tables. Knowledge was survival, and kitchens were schools as much as they were dining rooms. And yet, despite the hardship, there was beauty. Picture the golden crust of fresh bread carried from a communal oven, neighbors gathering to sniff and smile. Picture a child tasting honey for the first time, sticky fingers and wide eyes. Picture a family on a feast day, roasting their one chicken of the year, everyone waiting eagerly for their slice. These were moments of joy, rare but unforgettable. Even the way they flavored food carried symbolic meaning. Spices like pepper, ginger, and cinnamon were exotic, expensive, and powerful. To sprinkle pepper on a dish was to say, "I have connections, I matter." Saffron turned stews golden, not only changing flavor, but declaring status. Ordinary folks might never see these luxuries, but when they did, perhaps at a wedding or festival, they remembered the taste forever. Cooking also told stories. At night, families ate by firelight, passing bread while fathers told tales of saints or heroes. Meals became the backdrop for oral tradition. Folk tales, legends, even gossip spread at the dinner table, binding communities together through words as much as through food. And here's a striking truth: medieval cooking wasn't static. It adapted constantly. Famine years brought substitutions, bread stretched with beans or acorns. Good harvests meant more variety, more feasting. Trade routes opened, and suddenly nutmeg or cloves appeared in court kitchens. Even without technology, food culture evolved, one stew and one loaf at a time. What fascinates me most is that medieval people cooked not just to fill stomachs, but to weave life itself together. Food was family, food was faith, food was politics, food was survival. Every pot of pottage, simmering on a smoky hearth, carried those layers within it. And though centuries separate us, some things haven't changed at all. We still gather, we still flavor, we still celebrate with food. Their kitchens look alien to us, but the purpose feels the same. If the peasant's hearth was smoke and survival, the kitchens of the nobility were thunder and theater. Step inside a medieval castle on the eve of a great feast, and you'll find yourself in a world completely different from the quiet village cottage. Here, food was not only nourishment, but also a declaration of power. Castle kitchens were vast, echoing chambers, often built apart from the main hall to reduce the risk of fire. Great stone walls absorbed the heat of roaring fires, and smoke billowed through high vents instead of stinging eyes in low rafters. Where a peasant wife might tend a single cauldron, dozens of cooks, scullions, and assistants worked at once, each with a role to play. The clatter of knives, the grinding of spices, and the roar of turning spits filled the air like a symphony of labor. And the scale was staggering. A noble wedding, a coronation, or even a political gathering demanded hundreds of dishes. Oxen roasted whole, fish stews bubbling in cauldrons large enough to bathe in, pies stuffed with venison, poultry, dried fruit, and spices. Wine flowed in fountains. Pastries gleamed with sugar and saffron. The abundance wasn't just for taste, it was a language of wealth. A guest didn't need to understand politics to know that their host was powerful. They only had to look at the table. One fascinating custom was the creation of subtleties. These were dishes disguised as something else. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles or saints, pies that released live birds when cut, roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers and painted with gold leaf. Imagine sitting at a long wooden table when a servant carries in a dish that looks like a miniature fortress, only to discover it's made of pastry. Guests gasped, whispered, applauded. This was edible theater, designed to awe. But for every glittering display in the hall, there was sweat and smoke in the kitchen. Spits were turned by boys whose arms ached from hours of cranking. Knives slipped in greasy hands. Fires burned too hot, and scorched roasts, forcing apprentices to scramble. Accidents were common. Spilled cauldrons, burns, and cuts. In many ways, noble kitchens were just as dangerous as peasant hearths, only on a grander scale. What strikes me most is how political these meals could be. Seating was strategic. The closer you sat to the high table, the finer your food. Nobles ate white bread made from wheat, while lesser guests chewed darker loaves of rye. Meat was richer and more spiced near the lords, plainer near the back. A knight served plain mutton, while his lord dined on gilded swan. That wasn't coincidence. It was hierarchy, spelled out in bread and broth. Even refusing food carried meaning. To decline a dish could insult your host. To eat heartily showed trust. To toast with wine was to confirm an alliance. Every swallow was part of a performance. Every bite loaded with symbolism. In these halls, food was both feast and weapon. But let's not forget the cooks themselves. Unlike peasants who learned through family, castle cooks were professionals. They trained for years, rising from scullions who scrubbed pots to assistants chopping herbs, and eventually to master cooks overseeing entire feasts. Some became so respected that they advised lords directly, their skills seen as part of the household's prestige. Imagine being a cook who could make saffron custard or spice a venison pie so perfectly that nobles whispered your name. The ingredients in these kitchens tell another story. Spices were treasures. Cinnamon, pepper, ginger, nutmeg, and cloves arrived from distant lands through trade routes that stretched across continents. They were expensive, worth their weight in gold. To sprinkle pepper on a dish wasn't about flavor alone. It was proof of global connections, of wealth, of influence. When nobles ate spiced stews or golden saffron sauces, they were literally tasting the reach of their power. And yet, even in this glittering world, preservation still mattered. Salted fish, dried fruit, smoked meats. They filled storerooms alongside exotic luxuries. After all, even nobles couldn't eat gilded peacocks every day. On ordinary nights, their tables looked closer to prosperous merchant households. Roasts, bread, cheese, vegetables from their gardens. The feasts dazzled, but daily meals remained simpler than you might imagine. What fascinates me is how these kitchens connected to the outside world. The noble feast relied on peasants' harvests, on merchants' trade, on cooks' labor. Behind every golden pie were hundreds of unseen hands. Farmers sowing grain, fishermen hauling nets, millers grinding flour, servants plucking poultry. Nobility showed off power through food, but that power rested squarely on the backs of those below. At the end of a feast, leftovers didn't always go to waste. Chronicles describe how scraps were sometimes given to the poor waiting outside the castle gates. Was this genuine charity or just another performance of piety? Hard to say. But imagine the line of beggars stretching along the road, bowls in hand, waiting for cold pottage and stale bread after nobles had eaten their fill. Excess within, hunger without the contrast couldn't be sharper. Still, the spectacle of noble cooking shaped culture for centuries. The pageantry of a medieval banquet laid the foundation for modern fine dining, where presentation matters as much as flavor. Think about it. Our obsession with plating, with color, with surprise dishes, it all echoes those medieval subtleties. When you see a dessert arrive at a restaurant in a cloud of smoke or shaped like a sphere that cracks open, you're seeing the ghost of those sugar castles and feathered peacocks. And just like then, the cooks remain invisible. Guests praise the meal, toast the host, and rarely think of the sweaty, exhausted people who made it possible. That truth hasn't changed much. But here's a detail I love. Amid all the spectacle, humor sneaked in. Medieval cooks sometimes created joke dishes, mock eggs made of almond paste, pies filled with unexpected ingredients. Food was entertainment, and not always serious. Even the grandest feast had moments of laughter when a dish surprised the hall. So, how different were noble kitchens from peasant hearths? On the surface, everything: scale, ingredients, spectacle. But beneath it, the rhythm was the same. Fire had to be managed, meat had to be salted, bread had to rise. Hunger had to be met. The details dazzled, but the heartbeat of cooking was shared. And when the last goblet was drained, the last platter cleared, the kitchens returned to quiet. Fires smoldered low. Apprentices scrubbed greasy pots with sand. Servants licked wounds from burns and cuts. Tomorrow, it would all begin again. What lingers most isn't just the spectacle, but the fragility. Behind every golden dish was the constant risk of failure. A fire too hot, a roast spoiled, a noble displeased. One mistake could cost a servant their position, or worse. For all its glitter, noble cooking was built on tension as much as abundance. If the great halls of kings thundered with spectacle, monasteries whispered with order, step inside a medieval cloister, and the rhythm of life feels different. Here, every sound, every action, every bite was measured by bells, dawn prayers, midday labor, evening chants. And in between, meals not grand, not meager, but steady, humble, and tied to discipline. Monastic kitchens were the beating heart of this rhythm. Unlike noble halls, they didn't roar with trumpets or laughter. Instead, you'd hear the thud of a pestle grinding herbs, the gentle scrape of a ladle in a pot, the hush of voices keeping low out of reverence. Food here wasn't about impressing guests. It wasn't about flaunting wealth. It was about serving both the body and the soul. Benedictine and Cistercian rules make it clear. Food was meant to nourish, not to indulge. Meat from four-footed animals was forbidden to healthy monks, a reminder that appetite needed discipline. But that didn't mean monks starved. Far from it. Their tables held bread, beans, vegetables, fish, eggs, dairy and ale. Simple, filling, dependable. If peasants ate what they could scrape together, monks ate what was planned, portioned, and blessed. Bread, especially, was central. Baked in stone ovens inside the monastery walls, loaves came out in neat rows, brown and solid, the smell wafting through cloisters like a prayer of its own. A brother baker, hands floured white, pulled them from the oven one by one. Each loaf looked humble, but each also symbolized stability. Unlike peasants who relied on communal bakehouses, or nobles who flaunted wheat bread, monks controlled their own supply. And then there were the gardens. Monastic gardens were legendary, not just for leeks, cabbages, onions, and beans, but also for herbs. Sage, mint, fennel, thyme, dill. These plants flavored meals and healed bodies. The line between kitchen and infirmary blurred constantly. A broth of thyme soothed a cough. Mint calmed a restless stomach. Garlic was crushed into stews, not just for flavor, but because it was believed to fight sickness. Imagine a brother leaning over a simmering pot, stirring slowly, knowing that each spoonful was medicine as much as food. Fish dominated protein. Rivers, ponds, and trade brought in carp, eels, and salted herring by the cartload. Almond milk, surprisingly common in monastic cooking, became the base for stews, especially during fasting seasons when dairy was restricted. A bowl of fish in almond broth, sometimes brightened with saffron if the abbey was wealthy, might sound odd today, but for monks, it was both nourishment and a symbol of devotion. What fascinates me is how silence defined meals. In the refectory, long wooden tables stretched under vaulted ceilings. Monks sat in strict order, heads bowed. Nobody chatted. Instead, one brother stood at a lectern and read scripture while the others ate in silence. Imagine it, the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls, the clink of jugs pouring ale, the soft shuffle of sandals on stone. Eating became meditation. Every bite was deliberate. Every sip was a reminder of humility. And yet, contradictions crept in. Archaeological digs have found pig and cattle bones buried in monastery sites, suggesting that meat was eaten more often than the rules allowed. Some abbots dined privately, indulging in rich meals that rivaled noble courts. Was this hypocrisy or simply human weakness? Historians still debate it. But the tension is undeniable between the ideal of simplicity and the temptation of abundance. Feast days added another layer. On saints' days, monasteries loosened their rules, granting pittance, extra food beyond the daily fare, cheese, eggs, pastries sweetened with honey. Imagine the quiet delight of biting into a custard tart after weeks of beans and bread. No shouting, no applause, just small smiles, hidden behind vows of silence. Even here, joy flickered under discipline. What's striking is how consistent and reliable monastic meals were compared to life outside. While peasants went hungry during bad harvests, monasteries with their estates, tithes, and careful planning rarely starved. They ate less extravagantly than nobles, but more steadily than villagers. It's no wonder monks often lived longer, healthier lives than the lay people beyond their walls. Food here was balanced, predictable, almost scientific for its time. But these kitchens weren't free of danger. Fires still roared, cauldrons still tipped, apprentices still burned their hands lifting hot irons with only scraps of cloth for protection, and smoke lingered thick, coating lungs over years of service. Women in village kitchens suffered this most, but monks bore it too. To cook in the Middle Ages always meant carrying scars, whether visible or hidden. Still, the monastery kitchen carried a different weight, less chaos, more order. While a noble hall shouted its power, a cloister whispered its devotion. While peasants cooked with desperation, monks cooked with discipline. And in that discipline lies their legacy. Look closely at modern vegetarian diets, at herbal remedies, at the idea of food as medicine, and you'll see faint echoes of these cloister kitchens. Even the idea of eating in silence, savoring each bite mindfully, feels familiar to anyone who's practiced meditation at the table. Monks may not have intended it, but their kitchens shaped traditions that survive quietly to this day. One detail I love is how meals marked time. Bells tolled not only for prayers, but for eating. Breakfast might be skipped during fasting seasons, but dinner and supper came at set hours. In a world where famine loomed and peasants ate whenever food was available, monks built their lives around a steady, almost clock-like rhythm of meals. In many ways, they were living precursors to the schedules we still follow today. So, how did monks cook without modern kitchens? With fire, stone, patience, and prayer. They didn't need timers. The bells were their clock. They didn't need refrigerators. Gardens, ponds, and salted stores kept them supplied. They didn't need chefs shouting orders. They had rules, discipline, and faith to guide them. And yet, for all the simplicity, monastic food could be surprisingly refined. Sauces thickened with breadcrumbs, fish stewed with almonds, herbs blended into pottages. These weren't just gruels for survival. They were careful, balanced, even elegant within their limits. If noble halls dazzled, monasteries steadied. Both shaped the medieval table in ways we still feel. When the day ended, the kitchen fire was banked low, pots washed, bread cooling on shelves. The monks filed silently to their cells, stomachs filled just enough. Tomorrow the bells would ring again, and the rhythm would repeat. Discipline, devotion, and nourishment, woven into one. Step out of the cloister walls and walk down a country road, and you'll eventually find yourself in front of a timber-framed house with smoke curling steadily from the chimney. This isn't a peasant's hut, cramped and bare, nor is it a noble's castle with halls built for spectacle. It's something in between the home of a medieval merchant or a prosperous farmer. And what happens inside this kitchen is where practicality meets ambition, where survival blends with comfort, and where the foundations of what we'd call family cooking really begin to take shape. Unlike peasants who carried their dough to communal bakehouses, these families often had their own ovens tucked into the corner of the kitchen. Imagine the smell of fresh white bread drifting out into the street, softer and lighter than the coarse rye their neighbors ate. To tear into such a loaf was to taste prosperity itself. It wasn't just food, it was an announcement. We've made it. We have enough to share. And in a world where bread was everything, that statement carried weight. The meals in these homes looked different from both extremes. They weren't as extravagant as a noble banquet dripping with saffron and gold leaf, but they weren't as spare as a peasant's pottage either. Dinner might start with a thick cabbage soup, followed by a small roast hen rubbed with pepper or garlic. If fortune was kind, there might be a pie filled with minced meat, apples, and raisins, savory and sweet blended together in the medieval way. And on feast days, A custard tart or fritters dusted with sugar, enough to make the children beam. What really sets these kitchens apart is variety. Prosperous households could afford butter, something peasants rarely tasted. A knob of butter sizzling in a pan transformed a simple dish, turning onions golden, giving stews a richness that felt like luxury. They also had the patience and resources for pickling. Against the walls sat crocks filled with cabbage, carrots, even garlic steeped in vinegar. Through long winters, a spoonful of pickled vegetables could brighten a heavy meat stew, both tangy and refreshing. Scholars argue about just how middle these meals really were. Some say these families lived closer to peasants, with occasional treats. Others believe they leaned toward noble habits, mimicking their betters with spice-laced sauces and multiple dishes at feast times. The truth, as usual, probably lies in the middle. A prosperous farmer might serve a roast goose sprinkled with pepper on Sunday, but Monday's dinner was still pottage, bread, and ale. The sound of these kitchens was lively but not chaotic. A woman stirred a pot over the hearth, while her daughter kneaded dough on a floured board. A boy worked the churn, arms aching as the butter slowly thickened. A servant plucked feathers from a goose, tossing them into a basket that might later be used for pillows. Dogs padded across the floor. Children chattered. The fire crackled, pots clinked, knives chopped, spoons stirred. Unlike the thunder of noble kitchens or the hush of monasteries, this was the rhythm of family life. Busy, noisy, but steady. What fascinates me most is how these families helped shape taste itself. Many of the cookbooks that survive from the Middle Ages reflect dishes from these households. Sauces thickened with breadcrumbs, flavored with parsley or sage, pies filled with meat and fruit, fritters sprinkled with sugar. These weren't daily meals, but they were common enough to leave their mark. In a sense, it was this middle layer of society that bridged the gap between survival food and cuisine. And let's not forget the ale. While peasants brewed thin, weak batches just strong enough to drink safely, merchants and prosperous farmers could afford more malt. Their ale was stronger, richer, and sometimes even sold to neighbors. Kitchens in these homes weren't just places of cooking, they became small centers of community trade. Picture mugs clinking as neighbors dropped by, gossiping while sipping a freshly brewed ale. Food wasn't only consumed, it circulated. It connected people. But even in these homes, danger still lurked. Fires could flare unexpectedly. Knives slipped. Rats and insects crept toward grain stores. A single bad harvest or a failed trade voyage could send a family tumbling back toward peasant life. For all their comfort, survival was still fragile. That's why every meal carried more than flavor. It carried hope. The roast on the table, the loaf in the oven, the butter in the churn. Each one was a promise that fortune still held steady, that tomorrow would be no worse than today. As evening settled, the family gathered around their wooden table. Bowls of pottage arrived first, thicker than a peasant's but still familiar. Then came slices of goose, carved carefully so everyone had a share. Bread was passed, butter spread thick, pickled cabbage ladled out. Ale was poured. Children squirmed, dogs begged, laughter rose. It wasn't noble luxury, but it wasn't peasant struggle either. It was something in between, warm, steady, human. When you step outside after such a meal, the house glows softly through its shutters. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread clings to your clothes. Stars pricked the sky overhead, and you realize something profound. In medieval cooking, the middle mattered. These families bridged extremes, blending survival with aspiration. They shaped tastes that would, over centuries, become the foundation of what we recognize as modern cuisine. Cooking in these homes wasn't just sustenance, it was a statement. We are not poor, and we are not rich, but we are holding on, and we are striving. And that striving, the hope baked into bread, stirred into stew, brewed into ale, still speaks to us today. Walk a little farther from the bustling homes and market streets, and you'll eventually come to the outskirts of town. Here, beyond the noise of trade and the glow of taverns, stand the walls of a leper hospital or a charitable house run by monks and nuns. These were not hospitals in the modern sense, with trained doctors and sterile tools. They were places of refuge, where the sick, the poor, the abandoned, and the weary traveler could find one thing that mattered above all: something hot to eat. The kitchens in these places weren't designed to impress. They didn't serve roasted swans plated in gold or pies stuffed with exotic spices. Instead, they worked with whatever was available: barley, oats, herbs from the monastery garden, and sometimes a little fish or milk. Meals here were built to be gentle, easy to swallow, and comforting for bodies too weak to chew hard bread or salted meat. Imagine a pot of thin barley gruel simmering slowly, steam rising with the scent of sage, fennel, or mint. Each herb wasn't just flavor, it was medicine. Sage to soothe the stomach, fennel to ease coughing, mint to calm digestion. In a world without modern drugs, food itself was therapy. There's a haunting dignity in these kitchens. Some patients were too weak to feed themselves, so attendants or nuns lifted spoons to their lips. Others softened bread and broth so it could slide down easier, their hands trembling as they held the bowl. The silence inside wasn't the reverent hush of a monastery, nor the boisterous laughter of a feast hall. It was something else, heavy, quiet, but not hopeless. Every ladle of broth, every cup of warm ale was proof that someone cared enough to keep stirring the pot. Medical theory played a curious role here too. Doctors and clerics believed in balancing the four humors of the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. A feverish patient might be given a cooling lettuce broth. Someone weak from loss of blood might receive red wine or spiced meat to warm their body again. It sounds strange today, but to them, dinner could be diagnosis. Food was prescribed like medicine, served not just to fill the stomach, but to restore balance to the whole person. And then there were moments of grace. On feast days, or when wealthy donors gave gifts, the charity kitchens turned humble gruel into something close to celebration. Chroniclers describe roast meats, fish, or even sweet custards served to patients. Picture lying feverish on a straw bed and suddenly being handed a slice of honey cake or a sip of spiced wine. For that moment, illness felt less like punishment and more like belonging to God's mercy. Of course, most days were far simpler. Barley gruel, rye bread, and watered ale formed the daily diet. But even in its plainness, that food mattered. It wasn't spectacle, and it wasn't indulgence. It was survival wrapped in dignity. To hand someone a warm bowl of broth when they had nothing that was as powerful as any prayer. The sounds of these kitchens were quieter, too. No trumpets announcing dishes, no drunken laughter. Just the scrape of ladles against cauldrons, the soft coughs of patients waiting, and the murmured prayers of nuns as they stirred herbs into boiling water. The smell was sharp, with garlic believed to ward off sickness, mixed with rosemary, sage, and thyme. It was a different kind of perfume, one that spoke of healing more than hunger. And it wasn't just the patients inside who depended on these kitchens. On certain days, extra bread and stew were handed out at the gates. Long lines of beggars and travelers stretched down the road, bowls in hand, waiting for their share. The shuffle of bare feet, the clink of wooden bowls, the whispered thank yous. It was both mercy and ritual. Outside the castle, outside the markets, outside the families gathered around tables, there were always the forgotten. And for them, food given freely was survival itself. Even with all this compassion, the dangers of fire and burns never left. Cauldrons tipped, water splashed, smoke filled the rooms. But here the cooks carried another burden, tending to patients who vomited, who spilled their food, who needed feeding at odd hours. The line between cook and caretaker blurred completely. A nun might chop leeks with one hand, while steadying a feverish patient with the other. Compassion and exhaustion mixed in every movement. And yet, grace persisted. Imagine feast day in a hospital. Watery porridge replaced with meat pies, weak ale with spiced wine, and for once, laughter instead of coughing filling the room. These moments of abundance didn't erase the hardship, but they gave patients memories to hold on to, proof that even in suffering, joy could flicker. As you leave one of these kitchens, the smell of herbs and broth clings to your clothes. Behind you, voices murmur prayers, ladles scrape, bowls clink softly. Ahead lies the sleeping town, its streets dark and hushed. But you carry a powerful realization. Medieval cooking wasn't only about survival, spectacle, or even family. It was also about compassion, about seeing the weak, the poor, the forgotten, and saying, "Here, eat, you matter." That may have been the most profound cooking of all. Hey guys, welcome back. If you've been enjoying this journey through the smoky kitchens and forgotten corners of the Middle Ages, don't forget to hit that like button and follow, because this next chapter takes us straight into the world of politics served on silver platters. Step inside a castle on the night of a grand feast, and you'll realize quickly this isn't just about food, it's about power. Every roasted swan, every golden pie, every goblet of wine carried messages that went far beyond taste. Banquets were diplomacy. They were theater. They were weapons as sharp as swords, only plated in sugar and saffron. The scale alone is staggering. Chronicles of coronations and royal weddings describe kitchens preparing hundreds of dishes, oxen roasted whole, fountains pouring wine, custards and pies lined up in rows that seemed endless under the candlelight. Imagine a hall glowing with hundreds of candles, smoke curling into the rafters, the air thick with the scent of roasting venison, ginger, honey, and cloves. The roar of laughter and music crashes against the stone walls. It's not dinner, it's spectacle, and the spectacle could be outrageous. One popular trick was the subtlety food disguised as something else. A pie might be cut open, only for live birds to flutter out. Sugar could be sculpted into castles, saints, or knights. Entire peacocks were roasted and then dressed again in their feathers, sometimes even painted with gold leaf so they shimmered like treasure. Guests gasped, whispered, applauded. It was edible theater, designed to leave everyone talking long after the last crumbs were gone. But here's the catch. These shows weren't just for fun. They were statements. A gilded peacock wasn't only impressive. It shouted wealth and access to trade networks. A sugar sculpture was a reminder that the host had resources to import luxuries from faraway lands. Even the colors of dishes mattered. Saffron-dyed sauces, parsley green custards, and bright red wines were all deliberate choices to dazzle and dominate. Hierarchy played out on the very plates. Nobles closest to the high table received white bread trenches, finer and softer, while those further down ate from darker loaves. The best cuts of meat went to the most powerful guests, while others gnawed on lesser portions. Seating wasn't just about comfort, it was a living map of rank and influence. Every bite reinforced where you stood in the grand order of things. The kitchen behind this theater was chaos. Fires roared beneath, spits heavy with boar, goose, and venison. Cauldrons bubbled with fish stews for guests observing religious fasts. Ovens groaned with custards, spiced with cinnamon and sweetened with sugar. Apprentices darted across the floor with trays, dogs snapped at scraps, and the head cook barked orders like a general in battle. The noise was relentless, the heat staggering, the smell intoxicating. Even the way food was served was a performance. Trumpets sometimes announced the arrival of each course. Servants carried platters high, parading them through the hall before setting them down. Guests leaned forward, eyes wide, not just with hunger, but anticipation of what message each dish carried. Was this feast declaring friendship, wealth, victory, or warning? Politics simmered beneath every swallow. Envoys tasted carefully, always wary of poison. Nobles leaned in, whispering negotiations between bites. Toasts weren't only cheer, they were affirmations of loyalty, pledges disguised as celebration. To eat heartily was to show trust. To refuse could be an insult. In this hall, food itself spoke louder than words. And there were risks. Chronicles record feasts ending in drunken brawls, lawsuits over portions. Even cooks dragged before magistrates for shortchanging their employers. Abundance bred tension. To feed so many, so extravagantly, was to gamble with pride and patience. But when it worked, the effect was undeniable. A guild or lord who could throw a lavish feast declared victory before ever unsheathing a sword. One curious custom was mess dining, where groups of 4 or 6 shared a single platter. That meant carving and portioning became a test of fairness, trust, and even subtle power games. Imagine dividing a goose with 3 others, each eyeing the juiciest slice while trying not to appear greedy. It was politics in miniature played, out on a wooden plate. And here's the paradox. While nobles gorged inside, beggars often waited outside castle gates. Sometimes leftovers were handed out, sometimes not. Was it true charity, or just another performance of piety? The line of hungry faces outside was a stark reminder excess for some meant survival scraps for others. As the night wore on, the hall shifted. Candles burned low, the music softened, guests slumped in their seats, and the air turned heavy with smoke, sweat, and spilled ale. Servants swooped in to clear bones and scraps. Dogs licked greasy floors. Tomorrow the hall would smell sour, but for tonight it gleamed with glory. Walking out into the cool night air, you understand something profound. Medieval banquets weren't only about feeding bodies, they were about feeding ambition, cementing loyalty, and dazzling rivals. The kitchen was not just a place of cooking, it was a weapon of statecraft, wielded with sugar, spice, and spectacle. Last time, we stood in the heat of a castle banquet hall where every dish was a political performance. Tonight, we slip away from that thunder and step into a quieter corner of medieval life, the cottage kitchen at the end of the day. No gilded peacocks here, just bread, broth, and the small rituals that held families together. Most evenings for common villagers ended not with feasts, but with something far simpler. A pot of pottage simmering low over the embers, bread sliced into careful portions, maybe a bit of cheese if the goats had been kind that week. It was not spectacular, but it was steady, and that steadiness meant survival. The meal was functional, often the smallest of the day. Bread was coarse and brown, sometimes mixed with beans or bran to stretch the flour further. A small bowl of peas or beans stewed with leeks or onions might provide substance. Cheese, crumbly and tangy, was a blessing if the family kept animals. This was dinner for the majority of Europe, not lavish, not pretty, but filling enough to keep work going the next morning. And yet, even in this simplicity, there was ritual. Scholars still debate whether families ate together or in turns. Some argue that everyone gathered around the hearth, the flicker of firelight making the small space feel warm and sacred. Others believe hunger and hierarchy decided the order. Fathers and laborers first, wives and children last. The truth probably sat somewhere in the middle, a mixture of hierarchy, care, and compromise. Can you picture it? A father dipping bread into the pot, then handing the spoon to his wife, who carefully ladles portions into each child's bowl. A mother slicing cheese thin so every child gets a bite. It wasn't equal, but it was survival shared out as fairly as possible. The sounds of these kitchens were soft compared to noble halls. Logs popped and hissed. A baby whimpered, soothed with a crust dipped in broth. Dogs shuffled closer to the fire, paws twitching as they dreamed. Outside, the fields lay dark and silent, broken only by the call of an owl. The noise was not spectacle, but comfort. Storytelling often filled the silence. Chronicles mention parents telling tales of saints, heroes, or local legends, while children chewed slowly, wide-eyed in the flickering glow. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was the backdrop for memory and imagination. The firelight softened the soot-stained walls, turning even poverty into something almost magical for a few minutes. Still, hunger was never far. Bowls weren't always full. Portions weren't always enough. A child might scrape at the last bit of broth, wishing for more, while the mother tucked tomorrow's ration away. It was survival measured, spoon by spoon, with the quiet dignity of people who made do. Travelers who stepped into these homes often complained about the smoke-thick haze from open fires without chimneys that filled the rooms, stinging eyes and lungs. Villagers tolerated it because they had to. The same smoke that burned their throats also kept them warm and kept supper from going cold. And yet, amid the hardship, there was warmth. Children curling into straw beds, their bellies warm just enough. Parents whispering in low voices as the fire dimmed. Dogs curled close by, scraps in their bellies. This rhythm repeated for centuries, unchanged. Quiet suppers held the foundation of medieval life together. Because here's the truth: without these nightly meals, There could be no noble feasts, no guild banquets, no monasteries with fish ponds. The spectacular rested on the ordinary. The strength of markets, armies, and castles began in bowls of broth stirred by mothers at smoky hearths. As the fire burned low, families sometimes left the pot near the embers, a practice they called keeping the pot alive. The stew or porridge would continue to warm through the night, ready for breakfast at dawn. It wasn't wasteful. It was ingenious, a way of stretching effort and fuel just a little further. So while nobles raised goblets and monks whispered prayers, peasants ended their days with bread dipped in broth, stories traded across firelight, and hoped that tomorrow would bring another meal. Quiet, steady, essential. If we ended the night with bread, broth, and whispered stories around a peasant hearth. But where did those humble ingredients even come from? Tonight, we're stepping into the muddy boots of the farmers, because without the soil, there was no stew, no bread, no life. For most medieval people, cooking began in the field. Grain was king rye, barley, oats, and, when fortune allowed, wheat. These grains fed the world. They were ground into flour for bread, boiled into pottage, brewed into ale. You might think of wheat bread as ordinary, but in the Middle Ages, white bread was a luxury. Most villagers chewed coarse, dark loaves, flecked with bran, beans, or peas to stretch the flour further. Harvest season was the most intense moment of the year. Imagine entire dock, families in the fields, men swinging scythes, women gleaning fallen stalks, children hauling bundles. The air smelled of ripe grain, dust, and sweat. A family's entire winter survival could be decided in those weeks. A missed day meant hunger later. The open field system defined village farming. Strips of land belonged to different families but were worked communally. There were no fences, no private plots divided by hedges. Instead, cooperation kept everyone alive. One man's ox might plow a neighbor's strip, while women sowed seed together. Survival wasn't solitary. It was a collective choreography. Scholars still argue over how efficient this system was. Some say it wasted land, with fields left fallow too often. Others see it as sustainable, rotating crops and resting soil to prevent exhaustion. Either way, it tied neighbors together. Your survival was tangled with theirs, whether you liked it or not. The sounds of agriculture carried across villages. The thud of ox hooves pulling plows, the scrape of iron blades against stones, the swish of sickles slicing stalks, the groan of carts loaded with sheaves. Add the barking of dogs herding animals and the shouts of men across the fields, and you get the real soundtrack of medieval cooking before pots even touched fire. But fields meant more than just grain. Gardens and smaller plots produced beans, peas, onions, and cabbages. Turnips and parsnips added bulk to winter stews. Leeks thrived in damp soils. Orchards gave apples and pears, which could be eaten fresh, stewed into pies, or pressed into cider. By autumn, the countryside smelled of fermenting apples, sweet and sticky in the air. There were surprises too. Pigeons, today often dismissed as pests, were prized in medieval diets. Lords built dovecotes, tall towers filled with nesting birds. Their meat was considered a delicacy, and their eggs a welcome addition to kitchens. The constant cooing of doves wasn't just background noise, it was the promise of pies. Livestock shaped meals as well. Pigs rooted in forests, fattening on acorns before slaughter time. Sheep grazed on hillsides, their wool more valuable than their meat, but their mutton still filling many stew pots. Chickens clucked in nearly every yard, laying eggs that slipped into custards and pottages. Cows gave milk churned into butter and cheese, while their lowing echoed across villages like a steady reminder of survival. And yet famine hovered like a shadow. One bad harvest meant desperation. Chronicles tell of years when bread was bulked out with beans, peas, acorns, even ground ferns. Imagine chewing a bitter loaf, the taste of survival more than nourishment. Food was never guaranteed. Weather decided everything. Too much rain and grain rotted in the fields. Too much drought and nothing sprouted. Medieval villagers talked about the weather with the same urgency we talk about politics or money today. Their lives depended on the sky. A good year meant festivals and feasts. A bad year meant rationing, prayers, and thin soups. Processing the harvest was its own ritual. Women ground grain at home using heavy querns, or families carried sacks to the village mill, where water wheels clattered and stones ground kernels into flour. The smell of flour, dust filled barns and hair alike. Millers often got a bad reputation for skimming extra, but they were unavoidable gatekeepers of every loaf and every ale barrel. The farming year dictated cooking. Spring brought fresh greens, sorrel, spinach, leeks. Summer brimmed with fruits, fish, and tender vegetables. Autumn meant pork, paired with apples, harvest breads, and preserved vegetables. Winter narrowed the diet. Beans, salted meat, dried peas, and pickled cabbage. Cooking wasn't just recipes, it was a reflection of seasons and soil. One tradition that still lingers today was the harvest feast. After fields were cleared, villages gathered to celebrate. Bread was baked from the first grain, ale brewed from the first malt, meat roasted from newly slaughtered pigs. These weren't banquets of gold, leaf, and sugar castles. They were communal gratitude. Relief and hope rolled into one. Picture it: fiddles playing, mugs clinking, children darting between benches, while parents laughed despite exhaustion. The harvest feast wasn't just food. It was the joy of another year survived. And so, even before we think of pots, pans, or hearths, medieval cooking began with the soil. Every slice of bread, every mug of ale, every spoonful of pottage was born of sweat, weather, and stubborn hope. The fields were the foundation. Without them, kitchens would have nothing to cook. Last time we walked through muddy fields, orchards, and harvest feasts. But now let's shift from soil to parchment. Imagine a world where cooking knowledge had lived only in hands and memory, until suddenly, people began writing it down. Tonight we're exploring how medieval cookbooks captured the art of food, long before printed recipes filled our shelves. By the late Middle Ages, collections of recipes started circulating among wealthy households. Two of the most famous are the Forme of Cury, compiled by the cooks of King Richard II in England, and Le Viandier, often linked to the French cook Taillavent. These weren't guides for ordinary villagers. They were manuals of prestige, recording the kinds of dishes that dazzled courts, spiced roasts, almond-thickened sauces, delicate pastries. The instructions would look strange to modern eyes. No measurements, no oven temperatures. Instead, you'd read something like, "Take hens, boil them, add almonds and sugar, and serve." That was enough for trained cooks, whose senses told them when broth was thick or when spices were enough. The words were reminders, not step-by-step tutorials. One detail that leaps from these manuscripts is their obsession with color. Food wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle. Custards dyed green with parsley, sauces turned red with sandalwood, pies painted gold with saffron or even real leaf. Imagine walking into a hall where dishes gleamed like a rainbow. For diners, sight mattered as much as flavor. Historians debate who actually used these cookbooks. Some argue they were practical tools for cooks. Others believe they were trophies for nobles to show off in their libraries, symbols of refinement, not kitchen aids. Perhaps both were true. A cook might consult a smudged parchment while preparing spiced wine, while the lord of the house bragged about owning the same manuscript without ever touching a ladle. There's also humor hidden in some of these texts. Recipes describe playful tricks like mock eggs made of almond paste, or pies designed to release live birds when cut. These weren't just meals, they were performances, jokes in edible form. Can you picture the gasp of guests as pigeons flutter across the banquet hall, laughter mixing with applause? Another fascinating element is the overlap of medicine and cooking. Many recipes included healing notes: fennel to cool the body, ginger to warm it, almonds to soothe the stomach. Food was never separate from health. A pot of chicken broth wasn't just dinner, it was prescribed for the weak of stomach. Medieval cooks were part chef, part physician. But these books also reveal the gulf between classes. They call for saffron, sugar, cinnamon, ginger, all imports carried at great cost across deserts and seas. While peasants chewed acorn bread, nobles were instructed to gild their pies. The parchment itself carried privilege. To read it was to step into a parallel culinary universe. And yet these manuscripts remind us that memory alone was no longer enough. Knowledge had to be written down. A master cook might dictate to a clerk who scratched words onto parchment while broth simmered and knives clattered nearby. Imagine turning those pages centuries later and still seeing grease stains in the margins, evidence the book sat open on a kitchen table, close enough to be splattered by stew. The spread of these recipes was just as remarkable. Manuscripts were copied by hand and gifted between noble households. French sauces slipped into English kitchens. Italian custards reached northern feasts. Long before printing presses, food itself became diplomacy recipes, crossing borders along with ambassadors and merchants. And here's a thought. For every recipe written down, dozens were never recorded. They lived in the hands of women stirring pottage, in the minds of apprentices copying their masters, in oral traditions that vanished like smoke. What we read today is only a fraction of what once simmered. Still, the influence of those books can't be overstated. They turned fleeting flavors into memory. They gave us the first step toward modern cookbooks, the ancestors of every recipe card and online food blog. And they remind us that food is not just something we taste, it's something we record, share, and pass on. So next time you see a medieval recipe that says simply, add saffron until it be enough, remember, it's not imprecise. It's a whisper from a cook who trusted his hands more than his quill, and who believed taste could never be fully captured in ink. You know, it's easy to think medieval cooking belongs to dusty manuscripts and ruined castles. But the truth is, every time you sit down to a meal, you're tasting echoes of that world. Tonight we're going to trace how their habits, their fears, and their small victories at the hearth still shape what lands on our plates. And if you're enjoying this journey, don't forget to give the video a like and a follow. It helps keep these stories alive. The most obvious inheritance is bread. Medieval peasants lived on loaves so coarse they sometimes mixed in beans or even acorns when grain ran short. Wealthier households bragged with pale wheat bread, the kind neighbors could smell a street away. Today, whether it's sourdough or sandwich bread, the act of tearing into a crust feels timeless. Every bite is a thread connecting us to their grindstones, their querns, their bakehouses. And what about beer and ale? Back then, water was dangerous, often tainted with waste. So even children sipped weak ale daily, brewed by mothers and alewives in smoky cottages. Monks perfected stronger versions in monasteries, recipes that still echo in craft breweries today. That hazy glass of Belgian ale? Its roots stretch back to medieval cloisters, where brothers stirred bubbling mash as seriously as they recited prayers. Then there are pies. What we picture as a sweet treat was once a coffin, a thick, hard crust that served as a container more than food. Meat, fish, even fruit were sealed inside, baked, and carried to the table. Over centuries, that crust softened, sweetened, and became the flaky dessert we know. Next time you cut into an apple pie, think of it as a medieval invention dressed for modern taste. Some of their quirks became our traditions. They loved coloring food, dyeing sauces bright green with parsley, custards gold with saffron. We still chase that impulse with garnishes, plating, even rainbow sprinkles. Presentation mattered then as much as now. The medieval host wanted guests to gasp at a pie that looked like gold. Today, we snap pictures for Instagram. Different tools, same instinct. Their fears shaped us too. The terror of spoiled meat, moldy grain, or poisoned wells never left. We just built refrigerators, expiration dates, and food safety laws around the same old dread. When you check the best by label on milk, you're acting out a ritual as old as a peasant sniffing a clay jug of ale, wondering if it had turned sour. And recipes? Oh, the recipes. Medieval manuscripts scribbled vague hints like, boil until it be enough. Today we demand teaspoons, cups, and precise oven temperatures. But the impulse to record, share, and preserve is the same. From parchment spattered with broth, to your grandmother's recipe card, to an online blog, the desire is eternal. Don't let this flavor disappear. Even our idea of community meals carries their shadow. Guild feasts bound tradesmen together. Peasant harvest suppers brought whole villages to a single table. Noble banquets doubled as political theater. Today we call them office parties, Thanksgiving, or wedding receptions. But the principle hasn't changed. Food creates fellowship, whether in a smoky hall or a suburban dining room. And then there's comfort. The medieval family ending the day with coarse bread dipped in broth isn't so different from us spooning chicken soup on a cold night. They kept pots alive overnight on hearth embers. We keep leftovers in fridges. Both are small ways of telling ourselves there will be food tomorrow. If you strip away the microwaves, the stainless steel, the digital timers, the rhythm remains. Chop, stir, taste, share, laugh, worry, hope. In noble halls it was gilded spectacle. In monasteries it was devotion. In peasant huts it was survival. But all of it built the pattern we still live inside. So next time you sit at your table, think of it as more than a meal. Think of it as the continuation of centuries, a quiet inheritance from cooks whose names are forgotten but whose habits live in every bite. We've talked about bread, ale, and the legacies that still sit on our tables today. But now, let's step closer to the fire itself, because cooking in medieval times wasn't just about taste or survival, it was also about danger. And if you've been enjoying this series, don't forget to hit that like button and follow so we can keep uncovering history together. Picture a medieval kitchen. A dark room, no chimney at first, only a hole in the roof to let out smoke. The hearth blazes in the middle of the floor, sparks jumping as logs snap and collapse. It smells like meat roasting, bread baking, herbs drying, and, underneath it all, smoke thick enough to sting your eyes. People lived in that haze daily. Visitors often wrote about cottages filled with so much smoke you could barely see across the room. Yet villagers accepted it as the price of warmth and supper, but fire was always a threat. A stray ember could leap from the hearth, and with thatched roofs overhead, an entire house could burn in minutes. Chronicles record whole villages reduced to ash because one cooking fire got out of hand. Imagine the fear every time sparks flew too far. Families learned to bank fires carefully, pushing embers deep into ash at night to keep them smoldering but contained. To lose your fire wasn't just inconvenient, it meant cold, hunger, and begging a neighbor for a glowing coal. Burns were common. Pots hung from iron hooks over flames, cauldrons bubbled dangerously, and children played at their mother's feet, while hot broth splashed. Scars on hands and arms were as much a mark of daily life as calluses from farming. Cooking was labor, but it was also risk. Then there was spoilage. Without refrigeration, every piece of meat was a gamble. People salted, smoked, or dried it, but even so, food went bad fast. The smell of rot was never far. Eating the wrong slice of pork or fish could mean days of sickness or death. It's no wonder they leaned so heavily on spices and vinegar. They weren't just about flavor. They helped mask and sometimes slow decay. Pepper, garlic, mustard, all became armor against the unseen threat of food poisoning. And water? Always suspicious. Rivers and wells teemed with waste, so people trusted ale, wine, or boiled broths instead. A simple cup of water could be more dangerous than a mug of weak beer. Fear shaped their drinks, just as it shaped their meals. Rats and insects added another layer. Grain stored in sacks was vulnerable to gnawing teeth, to weevils burrowing in. Families guarded their stores like treasure, because one infestation could mean hunger before spring. Cats prowled kitchens, not as pets, but as workers, silent guardians against rodents. Still, kitchens weren't only filled with danger. They were also places of resilience. Families developed rhythms, drying herbs for winter, pickling vegetables, stirring pots for hours, so nothing stuck or burned. Every crackle of the fire, every hiss of dripping fat, was a reminder that life was fragile and that survival depended on vigilance. What strikes me most is how normal all this became. The smoke, the burns, the constant watch for spoilage. It wasn't seen as extraordinary, it was just life. And yet from that life came flavors, traditions, and habits that still shape us. If you've been enjoying this series, give this video a like and hit follow. It really helps keep the history alive on this channel. Now, let's head into the market square, Because medieval cooking wasn't only about what happened at the hearth, it was also about what people bought, sold, and tasted on the streets. Imagine stepping into a town market around the year 1350. The square is packed shoulder to shoulder. Carts creak, chickens squawk, dogs dart between legs. The smell hits you first, fresh bread from communal bakehouses, wheels of cheese sweating in the sun, barrels of salted herring giving off their sharp tang, and somewhere, the irresistible sizzle of hot food being cooked on the spot. Food markets weren't quiet affairs. Bakers shouted the price of loaves. Butchers hacked loudly at carcasses, their knives ringing on blocks. Alewives called out, offering mugs of frothy ale to thirsty farmers who'd been up since dawn. It was a symphony of survival, a mix of smells, sounds, and sights that made sure the town didn't go hungry. Street food was real, and it wasn't all that different from what we know today. Meat pies sold from wooden trays, small fritters fried in oil, bowls of pottage ladled out for a coin. Workers and travelers grabbed what they could afford and ate, standing in the square. Chronicles even mention roasted chestnuts, hot wines spiced with cloves, and pancakes sizzling on iron griddles. Does that sound a little like a medieval food truck to you? But food markets weren't just convenience, they were status on display. The bread you bought said who you were. White loaves, made from finely sifted wheat, were a luxury for the well-off. Dark rye or barley bread was the staple of peasants. Even in a crowded square, what sat in your basket marked your place in society. And then there were the rules. Town officials kept a close eye on weights and measures. Bakers who cheated customers by making loaves too small could be fined or shamed publicly by being forced to carry the offending bread through the streets. Butchers who sold spoiled meat risked heavy penalties. Food wasn't just food. It was a matter of trust and community health, long before anyone had refrigerators or health inspectors. Markets also reveal how global medieval kitchens were becoming. Alongside onions, turnips, and local herbs, you'd find sacks of imported pepper, ginger, even saffron for those who could afford them. These exotic spices traveled across continents, from India and the Middle East to Europe, changing the way people seasoned their meals. A simple pie might suddenly taste richer, sharper, more exciting, thanks to trade routes stretching thousands of miles. Of course, not everyone tasted that world. For many, the market was about survival, buying just enough beans or barley for another week. But for others, it was a chance to show off prosperity, to pick up almonds, honey, or preserved fish for a household feast. The marketplace wasn't just about buying food, it was about community. Gossip flowed as freely as ale. Deals were struck over baskets of eggs. Songs and stories were traded along with herbs and cheese. The market square was where kitchens began, before the pots, before the fire, before the flavors. And if you listen closely in your imagination, the sound of knives clinking, hammers pounding, and merchants shouting hasn't vanished. Walk through a farmer's market today, and you might hear the same rhythm, smell the same mix of bread and smoke, feel the same pulse of life around food. Let's step away from the busy markets and talk about what happened when people couldn't rely on a hearth or a kitchen. How did travelers, pilgrims, or soldiers feed themselves in medieval times without any of the comforts of home? The truth is, meals on the road were rarely satisfying. Pilgrims trudging toward holy sites, like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, carried little more than bread, dried fish, or hard cheese. These foods were portable, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive days stuffed in a satchel. Water was often risky to drink, so ale or weak wine was the safer option, even if it went sour. Imagine walking mile after mile with only a crust of dark bread and a sip of thin ale to keep you going. For soldiers, it was even harsher. Campaign accounts tell us that armies lived on biscuit bread, rock-hard, twice-baked loaves that could last weeks. Soldiers sometimes softened them in broth or ale, but many simply gnawed through them, breaking teeth in the process. Salted pork, dried peas, and whatever could be foraged or stolen filled out their rations. If a local village refused to supply food, soldiers had little choice but to go hungry or take what they needed by force. Cooking in the field was crude. A small fire dug into the ground, a battered pot slung across stones, maybe a spit if they were lucky enough to catch game. Chronicles mention soldiers roasting rabbits or pigeons over open flames, while others boiled whatever beans they had left. Pilgrims often carried little brass or iron pots too, so they could make a thin pottage when they stopped for the night. But it wasn't all bleak. Along the great pilgrimage routes, hospices and inns provided food, sometimes free for the devout, sometimes for a coin. These meals were simple: a bowl of vegetable broth, a slab of rye bread, maybe a little cheese. Nothing fancy, but after days of marching, it must have felt like heaven. For many travelers, the kindness of strangers, monks, villagers, fellow pilgrims meant the difference between hunger and survival. One fascinating detail is how resourceful people became with herbs. Foragers plucked wild sorrel, nettles, or garlic from the roadside, throwing them into pots to stretch out meager rations. Soldiers sometimes flavored their thin stews with whatever greens they could find. Even in hardship, a touch of flavor mattered. It kept the spirit alive as much as the body. And then there were the inns, bustling with travelers, merchants, and storytellers. In larger towns, innkeepers served hot meals, pies, roasted meats, ale, and bread. For pilgrims who had lived on stale rations, stepping into a noisy inn filled with laughter and the smell of roasting goose must have been overwhelming. Inns weren't just shelters. They were crossroads of culture, places where cooking traditions met, where gossip and recipes traveled as easily as people did. Traveling kitchens weren't polished, but they were inventive. They turned stale bread into soups, stretched dried peas into stews, and used ale when water was unsafe. Meals on the road remind us of something important. Food was never just about taste. It was survival, resilience, and community, even when shared among strangers huddled around a smoky roadside fire. Let's step off the roads of pilgrims and into the rolling decks of medieval ships, where cooking wasn't just difficult, it was sometimes life or death. Sailing in the Middle Ages was not for the faint of heart, and food was one of the biggest challenges. Imagine being weeks at sea with no refrigeration, no fresh market, and no chance of restocking until landfall. What kept sailors alive? Salt. Salt was the backbone of seafaring diets. Pork and beef were salted down into barrels, packed so tight the meat often came out as hard as wood. Sailors soaked it in water to soften it before boiling. But even then it could be so tough. You needed a knife just to chew a bite. Hard bread, often called ship's biscuit, was another staple. These weren't the kind of biscuits we know today. They were rock-solid slabs of flour and water baked again and again until they were nearly indestructible. Sailors joked they were as hard as the planks beneath their feet. To make them edible, men dunked them in ale, stew, or even seawater. Some were infested with weevils, but hunger made the choice simple. You ate around the bugs or swallowed them with the bread. Water was risky. Stored in wooden casks, it went stale quickly, turning slimy and foul. Ale and weak wine were safer, but those too could sour after weeks. Sailors sometimes mixed sour wine with herbs or spices to disguise the taste. Chroniclers mention lemon or vinegar added when available, both to sharpen flavor and though they didn't know the science to ward off scurvy. Cooking aboard ship was itself a miracle. On smaller vessels, fires were banned outright for fear of burning down the wooden hull. Meals were cold, salted, and monotonous. On larger ships, a small brick hearth called a caboose or galley was built, where cooks boiled salted meat, peas, or oatmeal in great iron pots. The smell of smoke mixed with tar and seawater, coating everything. Picture sailors crowded around a single pot, bowls in hand, waiting for a ladle of steaming pottage. Fish was a blessing when it could be caught. Nets hauled in cod, herring, or mackerel, which were either boiled fresh or salted down for later. A sudden haul of fish was a feast, breaking the monotony of salted meat. Records even describe sailors celebrating with fried fish when oil was available, a rare luxury at sea. One fascinating little detail is the role of cheese. Hard cheeses, like aged cheddar or sheep's cheese, traveled well. They could last months without spoiling and added much-needed fat and flavor. Alongside dried beans and peas, cheese helped prevent starvation when meat ran out. And when barrels of ale ran dry, sailors sometimes drank thin broth made from boiling beans or grain, a reminder that every scrap was precious. Life aboard ship was grim, but food became ritual. The sound of a cook's ladle striking the rim of a pot called men to eat, just as a bell summoned them to prayer. Meals were brief, noisy, and often unsatisfying, but they bound the crew together. They grumbled about tough meat and stale bread, but they shared it shoulder to shoulder, with the sea raging around them. Yet even in hardship, small celebrations happened. When ships sighted land after weeks of gray water, sailors cheered not just for safety, but for fresh food. Chronicles describe men gorging on fruit, vegetables, and fresh meat as soon as they docked. Apples, onions, even a handful of herbs must have tasted like paradise after weeks of salt and biscuit. So when we think of medieval cooking, it's easy to picture noble feasts or village hearths. But out at sea, the kitchen was a barrel, a pot, and a stubborn will to endure. And in a strange way, those meals, however bleak, shaped trade, war, and exploration. Without salted meat and hard biscuit, ships couldn't have crossed seas, and history itself might have sailed a different course. Now, let's talk about something that defined medieval cooking more than almost anything else: the battle against spoilage and the glittering power of spices. Before refrigeration, every meal was a race against time. Meat spoiled quickly, milk turned sour, and bread went stale. So people leaned on preservation. Salt was king, just as it was at sea. Hogs and cattle were slaughtered in autumn, their flesh rubbed with salt, smoked, or hung in cool cellars. Salted pork might keep for months if carefully stored, though by the time it was eaten, it could be tough, fibrous, and unbearably salty. To make it edible, cooks boiled it in several changes of water, sometimes adding herbs to soften the flavor. Smoking was another trick. Whole hams, eels, or sausages were hung in smokehouses where slow fires of oak or beech infused the meat with a rich tang. That smoky taste wasn't for style, it was survival, keeping rot at bay. Imagine walking past a medieval village and seeing curls of blue smoke rising from sheds, carrying the scent of preservation through the air. Fermentation was everywhere too. Cabbage became sauerkraut, milk became cheese, grain became ale. Each of these processes stretched the life of fragile ingredients, and at the same time created new flavors that defined medieval tables. A wheel of cheese wasn't just food, it was stored milk, transformed into a sturdy, portable meal that might last all winter. Now here's where things get interesting. Beyond survival, taste mattered. And in the Middle Ages, taste often meant spice. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, saffron. These weren't local. They came from India, the Middle East, even as far as the Spice Islands. To own them was to own a piece of the world. Spices did more than add flavor. They signaled wealth. A merchant sprinkling pepper on his stew was making a statement. I can afford what most people only dream of. Chronicles tell us that nobles poured saffron into rice or custards, turning them golden as a display of luxury. Some even gilded pies with gold leaf itself, as if to say their wealth could be eaten. But spices also had a practical side. They masked the taste of salted or slightly spoiled meat. Imagine a venison stew simmered with cinnamon, ginger, and wine. The richness wasn't only delicious, it was camouflage. For ordinary villagers, spices were nearly out of reach. They relied instead on local herbs, sage, parsley, thyme, dill plucked from gardens or hedgerows. These herbs brought freshness, cut through the heaviness of pottage, and added their own medicinal benefits. Historians still argue about just how heavily spices were used. Some believe nobles drowned everything in pepper and sugar, creating sweet, savory stews that would shock us today. Others think recipes were exaggerated for show, and in practice spices were used more sparingly. Either way, spices were tied to identity. To season food richly was to declare status. To go without was to mark yourself as poor. Pickling was another lifesaver. Onions, garlic, and cabbages were submerged in vinegar, sometimes with mustard seed or honey, producing sharp, tangy sides that cut through fatty meats. Vinegar was more than flavor, it killed bacteria before people even knew what bacteria were. Households that mastered pickling had brighter winter diets and fewer stomach troubles. And then there was sugar. Imported at great cost, sugar was treated as both medicine and luxury. Apothecaries sold it alongside spices, and cooks worked it into sweetmeats, candied nuts, and syrups. To serve sugar at a feast was to declare that you sat close to power and trade. For most villagers, honey was the sweetener of choice, harvested from skeps buzzing in orchards. A drizzle of honey in porridge was a rare delight. So in the medieval kitchen, preservation and spice weren't just about taste. They were about survival and power, about stretching the harvest and flaunting connections to distant lands. Every salted ham, every gilded tart, every jar of pickles told a story of how people fought rot, how they valued flavor, and how they showed the world who they were. And when you sit down today with a crust of bread, a wedge of cheese, or a sprinkle of pepper on your dinner, you're tasting the same solutions they relied on centuries ago. For peasants, the kitchen was often nothing more than a corner of the hut. A single open hearth burned in the center or along the wall, its smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof, or more often, filling the room until it seeped out through thatch. There were no chimneys in most homes until the late Middle Ages, so families lived in a haze of wood smoke. It stung the eyes, blackened the rafters, and coated lungs with soot, but it kept the stew bubbling and the family alive. Utensils were basic. A cauldron hung on an iron hook, swinging over the fire. Clay pots sat on stones near the embers. Wooden spoons stirred, and knives cut everything from meat to kindling. Meals simmered slowly, because fast cooking was impossible without controlled flames. The hearth was the heart of the home, where food was made, where warmth gathered, and where stories were told while bread baked against the coals. But in castles and manors, the kitchen was an entirely different beast. These were massive, smoky chambers, sometimes separate buildings to reduce the risk of fire. Imagine walls of stone blackened by centuries of smoke, floors sticky with grease, and ceilings high enough to trap the haze. Huge hearths lined the walls, each big enough to roast an ox on a spit. Cauldrons large enough to bathe in boiled over open flames, and dozens of servants hustled around, each with a task: plucking geese, grinding spices, tending fires, carrying platters. The noise must have been deafening, metal pots clanging, spit squeaking as boys turned them, cooks shouting orders, dogs barking underfoot, and the constant roar of fire. Add to that the danger. Boiling broth could scald, knives slipped easily, and sparks often set straw floors alight. Kitchens weren't cozy, they were battlefields of labor. One fascinating detail is how food moved from kitchen to table. In castles, meals were carried through passageways on great wooden trenchers or in massive covered dishes. Servants rushed to deliver them before they cooled. In smaller homes, the pot simply came off the fire and was ladled into wooden bowls, shared by everyone at once. Tools tell their own story. Skillets with long legs stood directly in the coals, allowing fat to drip down while meat sizzled. Mortars and pestles ground herbs into sauces. Bellows fed fire with air, while spit, boys, often children, turned heavy rods of roasting meat for hours at a time, their faces red from the heat. Even bread making required effort. Without ovens in every home, many villagers took their loaves to communal bakehouses, paying a fee to use the great stone oven tended by the village baker. And then there's the smell. Medieval kitchens were soaked in it. Smoke, grease, roasted meat, boiled cabbage, and fish all blending together. For nobles, that smell meant abundance. For peasants, it meant survival. Either way, the air carried the memory of every meal cooked before. Kitchens, whether humble or grand, shaped daily life. They were places of danger, of labor, of endless repetition. But they were also where families gathered, where survival began, and where the art of cooking slowly evolved into the traditions we still recognize today. For peasants, meals were simple but deeply communal. The family gathered around the hearth, not at a polished table but on benches or stools. A single pot of pottage simmered all day, and when it was time to eat, everyone dipped in. Sometimes there were wooden bowls, sometimes Thick hunks of stale bread served as trenchers' edible plates that soaked up broth. Children ate last or shared with their mothers, while fathers and working men were often served first. This wasn't cruelty, it was survival. The strongest workers needed fuel for the next day's labor. Contrast that with monasteries. There, meals unfolded in near silence. Monks sat in long rows, listening to scripture being read aloud while they ate. Food was modest vegetables, bread, cheese, and fish, but it was steady, often more reliable than what peasants outside the walls could expect. Every bite was an act of discipline, a way to nourish body and soul without indulgence. And yet, even in these austere halls, feast days broke the monotony. A custard tart sweetened with honey, a roast fish with herbs, a small luxury that reminded monks that joy was also a gift of God. Noble dining, of course, was something else entirely. Great halls buzzed with spectacle. Guests sat according to rank. The closer to the high table, the finer the food. White bread for lords, darker bread for lesser guests. Platters were shared in groups, meaning you weren't just eating, you were negotiating status with every bite. To refuse a dish might be seen as insult. To eat heartily showed trust in your host. Politics and appetite were always intertwined. And yet, for all the pomp, servants still hovered at the edges, ready to swoop in and claim scraps. Chronicles often describe leftovers carried to the poor outside castle gates. Whether this was genuine charity or a performance of piety remains debated, but it highlights the glaring contrast: lavish excess within, hungry mouths without. One fascinating custom was the idea of mess dining. 4 or 6 people shared one dish, carving meat, dividing bread, ladling stew. Fairness was expected, but envy was never far. Imagine a knight slicing just a little too generously for himself, while his companions exchange glances. In a sense, the medieval table was a mirror of society: hierarchy, trust, rivalry, and community all simmering together with the food. And don't forget the sounds. In a peasant cottage, it was quiet, just the crackle of fire, murmured conversation, maybe a bedtime story told while chewing bread. In a monastery, only the scrape of spoons and the steady voice of a reader broke the silence. But in a noble hall, trumpets announced courses, minstrels strummed lutes, dogs barked underfoot, and laughter roared louder than the fire. Each table had its own soundtrack, its own rhythm of life. So whether it was a family of 6 sharing thin broth in a smoky hut, monks bowing their heads over beans and bread, or nobles cutting into golden pies beneath candlelight, one truth connects them all. Eating was never just about hunger. It was about belonging, about order, about showing who you were in a world where food carried meaning far beyond taste. Let's start with the backbone of the medieval diet: grains. For peasants, bread wasn't just food, it was life. Coarse loaves made from rye, oats, or barley kept families going through long winters. Wheat was the most prized grain, producing softer, whiter bread, but it was often reserved for nobles or the wealthy. Imagine the smell of a newly baked loaf: dense, earthy, not the fluffy kind we know today, but filling enough to be called the staff of life. Alongside bread came pottage, the endless stew of grains and vegetables that bubbled day after day on peasant hearths. Whatever you had went in: peas, beans, onions, carrots, turnips. If you were lucky, a bit of bacon fat or a bone added flavor. If not, it was plain, but sustaining. This dish, more than anything, fed medieval Europe, but not all ingredients were humble. Spices brought glamour to noble kitchens. Cinnamon, ginger, pepper, saffron, exotic flavors carried by caravans and ships along the Silk Road. These weren't sprinkled casually. They were symbols of wealth and status. A dish tinted gold with saffron wasn't just tasty, it shouted power. Sugar, too, though rare, was treated like a spice. Imagine seeing candied almonds or honey-glazed pastries at a feast. It was as much about display as about sweetness. For protein, peasants leaned on beans, cheese, and occasional eggs. Meat was rarer, but pigs provided pork, chickens gave eggs, and cows or goats gave milk. Sheep, while vital for wool, also ended up as mutton in stews. Hunting rights were fiercely guarded, so deer, boar, and game birds were mostly noble fare. That's why a roasted venison pie or gilded swan at a castle banquet wasn't just food, it was a declaration of privilege. Fish, though, crossed class lines. Rivers, ponds, and the sea provided herring, eel, cod, and carp. Salted or smoked, fish filled tables, especially on religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. Monasteries, in particular, became experts at breeding fish in ponds, ensuring a steady supply. Imagine a monk ladling out eel stew seasoned with herbs from the abbey garden, simple yet rich in meaning. Vegetables and fruits had their place too, though not in the same way we use them today. Onions, garlic, leeks, and cabbage were staples, hardy enough to last through seasons. Apples and pears filled orchards, eaten fresh or preserved in cider. In summer, berries and cherries appeared at markets, bright moments of sweetness. And when winter loomed, families turned to dried peas, salted meat, and pickled cabbage to carry them through. One fascinating detail lies in herbs. While spices came from abroad, herbs grew right outside the kitchen door. Parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme, not just for flavor, but for medicine. A sprig of sage could heal. A pinch of mint could soothe the stomach. Medieval cooking blurred the line between food and remedy in ways we still see echoes of today. What's striking when you look at these ingredients is how seasonal, local, and precarious everything was. A failed harvest didn't mean higher prices, it meant hunger. A generous trade route didn't just mean tastier stews, it reshaped entire cuisines. The food on the table was always a conversation between soil, weather, trade, and faith. So whether it was coarse rye bread dipped in thin pottage, or saffron-tinted custards glittering at a noble feast, medieval ingredients told a story not just of taste, but of survival and status. The centerpiece of any kitchen wasn't a stove, it was the open hearth. Picture a wide fireplace taking up half a wall, with logs piled high, glowing embers, and iron chains dangling from beams. This was the engine of medieval cooking, but it was also dangerous. Sparks leapt, children hovered too close, and cooks spent their lives with smoke stinging their eyes. No knobs to control the flame, just instinct, patience, and constant adjustment. Above those flames hung the mighty cauldron, suspended by hooks or chains. Here stews simmered endlessly, pottage bubbled, and ale warmed. The size of these pots is astonishing, big enough to feed dozens, sometimes armies. Stirring them wasn't dainty work. It took long wooden paddles, arms sore from turning, and an eye to keep it from scorching at the bottom. Then there were the spits. Meat roasting wasn't a quiet process, it was an operation. Long iron rods skewered whole animals, turned constantly by hand. Wealthier households sometimes had turnspit dogs, small breeds trained to run inside wheel contraptions, like living rotisseries, powering the spit as meat sizzled and fat dripped into trays. It was labor, innovation, and desperation rolled into one. For baking, most peasants didn't even have ovens at home. Instead, they relied on communal bakehouses. Families prepared their dough, marked loaves with unique cuts or symbols, and carried them to the village oven. Imagine dozens of neighbors crowding around as loaves were slid in, the smell of baking bread drifting across the village. It was efficiency, yes, but also community. Ovens were heavy stone constructions, heated by burning wood until the interior glowed. Ashes were swept out, and the retained heat cooked bread, pies, or even roasted meat. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the bread burned. Too late, and it never rose. Other tools were humble but essential. Mortars and pestles ground spices, herbs, and grains. Knives and cleavers chopped meat and bone, while wooden spoons stirred endlessly. Ladles carved from horn or wood dipped broth from cauldrons. Baskets, clay jugs, and ceramic bowls carried water, milk, or ale. Iron griddles sat directly on embers for frying pancakes, fish, or flatbreads. These tools weren't luxuries, they were survival. Cooking methods reflected both ingenuity and limits. Boiling was safest, and most common soups and stews stretched ingredients and killed bacteria. Roasting was spectacle, used in noble feasts to show abundance. Baking required coordination with shared ovens, and pickling, salting, and smoking preserved food long past its season. Every technique was about making the most of what little you had, stretching food for as many mouths as possible. And here's something easy to overlook. Medieval kitchens were loud, hot, and chaotic. The crackle of logs, the hiss of fat dripping into flames, the groan of cauldrons, the yells of cooks giving orders, all of it layered into a soundscape that was part worksite, part battleground. It wasn't romantic. It was gritty, exhausting, and sometimes dangerous. But out of that chaos came the meals that held communities, families, and kingdoms together. So when we picture a medieval kitchen, we shouldn't think of polished countertops or stainless steel pots. Think instead of soot-stained beams, flickering firelight, iron cauldrons, wooden spoons, and the smell of smoke that clung to everything. That was the reality, and it worked. For peasants, dinner wasn't about courses or ceremony. It was about filling bellies. Families often ate from a single shared pot, dipping wooden spoons into the same stew, scooping from the same bowl of pottage. Bread doubled as both food and utensil, thick crusts torn apart and dunked into broth, or used to sop up sauces. Meat was rare. If it appeared, fathers often got the first share, followed by sons, while women and younger children ate last. Hierarchy didn't stop at the field, it followed them to the table. Meals for the poor were brief, practical, and sometimes silent. But even in that simplicity, food brought warmth and a sense of togetherness. Imagine a cottage lit by a single rushlight. Children gathered around their mother, dunking crusts into steaming pottage, while the father sipped weak ale after a long day's work. No feast, no spectacle, just survival, softened by the comfort of being together. Noble dining was another world entirely. In castles and manor halls, ritual mattered as much as taste. Meals began with hand-washing ceremonies, water poured into basins by servants while guests dried their hands on fine cloths. Seating was strict. The closer you sat to the Lord, the more important you were, and the better the food you received. White bread trenches for the elite, darker loaves for those further down the table. It was food as a map of power. Plates, as we know them, didn't exist. Instead, people used trenches, thick slices of bread that absorbed juices from meat and sauce. When the meal ended, these bread plates were sometimes eaten, given to the poor, or tossed to dogs. Knives were shared, spoons used communally, and forks were almost unheard of until much later. Eating with your hands wasn't crude, it was expected, though with etiquette, only use 3 fingers, don't lick them, and never reach across your neighbor's portion. A noble feast unfolded in courses. First came soups or pottages, then roasted meats, pies, and pastries. Finally, sweets and subtleties, sugar sculptures, spiced wine, candied almonds. Between courses, entertainers filled the hall with music, juggling, or storytelling. The meal itself was theater, reinforcing wealth, hierarchy, and control. Even so, not every noble table was endless luxury. On fast days, meat disappeared, replaced with fish or vegetable dishes. Monks and priests dined on the same cycles, balancing feasting and restraint. Ordinary families in towns or villages also tried to mimic these patterns when they could, perhaps baking a pie with apples and pork for a special Sunday, or serving ale stronger than usual to mark a holiday. One fascinating detail: communal dining built trust, but also revealed tension. Sharing a trencher with another person meant negotiating space, dividing portions fairly, and watching manners closely. A greedy bite could insult a neighbor, a generous gesture pushing the choicest morsel forward could build goodwill. The table was as much about relationships as it was about food, so whether it was a peasant's hut or a baron's hall, meals were never just about feeding hunger. They were about order, ritual, and community. Food brought people together, but also reminded them where they stood. Hey guys, we've walked a long road together. From smoky peasant cottages and bustling market stalls to gilded banquet halls and monastic kitchens, we've seen how food in the Middle Ages wasn't just about survival. It was about identity, faith, power, and community. Every pot of pottage told a story of resourcefulness. Every noble feast was a play performed with meat and spice as its actors. And every simple supper by the fire carried a family through one more night. The truth is, medieval kitchens looked nothing like ours. No stoves, no refrigerators, no clean countertops. Just open flames, wooden spoons, iron pots, and human ingenuity. And yet, the rhythms feel familiar. The clatter of chopping, the smell of bread rising, the way people gathered together at the end of the day, it's the same heartbeat we know now. What strikes me most is that medieval cooking was about more than taste. It was about trust, resilience, and hope. Whether it was monks turning herbs into healing broth, merchants spicing a pie to impress neighbors, or mothers stretching a single loaf to feed hungry children, food carried meaning deeper than flavor. It was memory. It was love. It was survival. And maybe that's the legacy we still hold. Every time we sit at a table, whether it's with family, friends, or even alone. We're echoing a practice as old as history itself, sharing food, sharing life. So as we close this journey tonight, I hope you carry a little warmth with you. Picture the glow of a medieval hearth, the smell of bread on the embers, the quiet murmur of stories told by firelight. Let it soften the edges of your day. Thank you for joining me on this long walk through history. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps me keep bringing you stories like this. And now, it's time to rest. Good night, my friends. May your dreams be warm, your sleep be deep, and may tomorrow greet you with peace.